Welcome to That Worldview podcast and the Single series. Today, I've got Aaron Sikele, a good family friend, joining us for the podcast. We're going to be talking all things single, all the relevant questions. I've got some really good questions to ask him, and I'm really looking forward to his input on this subject.
David and I go way back. I've known David for probably most of his life. Our parents were actually missionaries together in the Fiji Islands for several years, and then our relationship just kind of has existed. Sometimes we were close geographically, at other times we were a lot distant. So, for example, we were together for a period of time in Southern California, and our paths would often cross during that time at youth camps and those kind of things. And then for the last 9 years, I've been in Southern Indiana as a youth pastor, and then just returned back to the West Coast. We're now here in Camas, Washington, church planting here for the last year. So we are actually recording this in the basement of the church here. So this is awesome.
Yeah, it's really, I really enjoyed watching you start here and then coming and helping once or twice, seeing everything happen.
David has been like a incredible help early on when we just got here. David and his brothers were very helpful.
We tore apart that.
Yes. Oh, man, just in a practical level, cleaning up the property, the parsonage, and doing a ton of work. So, yeah, we are very grateful to the help that David has been to us.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed being here, And then obviously my brother came down for like 3 months.
Yep.
I'm sorry. No, I'm just
Sorry, Josiah.
if you ever listen to this. No, that's great. So no, it's been really awesome knowing their family. Your dad is here, Aaron Sikele, which we'll be doing a podcast episode with him as well, probably on Monday, talking about a walk with God. And he's really been a help to me in that realm. And I think he'll really be insightful for that podcast.
Yeah. My dad has got some really good wisdom from experience and obviously exposure to the scriptures as well. So that'll be a blessing too.
Yeah. By the way, Aaron actually has their own podcast called Abide, correct?
Yeah, Abide Podcast, or the Abide Podcast. It's also connected to our church ministry. And so you can find our sermons and teachings on there, as well as we'll be having conversations coming up this year around just following Jesus and what it means to be a true disciple of Jesus. So you can jump on over there and listen to that as well.
And I would encourage that. There's some really good stuff over there. Okay, introductions are done. I think more stories will come out, I'm sure, as we go through. First question. So I have a list of questions, about 5 questions that I thought would be really great to kind of get the conversation started, and I think very needful questions. And we'll chase all the rabbit trails and all that good stuff as we go. The first one I think would be good to talk about was, were you content as a single person?
That would be that's kind of a loaded question.
It is. A lot of these are filled with rabbit trails.
I think there were definitely seasons of surrender to singleness, as well as other seasons of kind of this pining or seeking for companionship, which, by the way, is a natural thing that God has given us. Mm-hmm. God created us to live in community, first of all, and He also created us to have companionship. Going back to the very beginning when God first created the first man and first woman. I mean, when He looked at Adam, He said, "It is not good that he is alone."
It's true. Yep.
God created man, said it's not good. It was one of His only creations that He said, "This is not good." So what's beautiful about that is there's that natural desire. So, but to say I was content, I think there were seasons where I had to surrender that to the Lord. And I watched God honestly bring some beauty in those seasons. I embraced, rather than trying to pursue specific relationships, I embraced friendships just as a whole. And that was I think primarily in my season of between the ages of 18, 19, 20, 21, and 22, somewhere in there. I got married at 23. So that season there, from my mid to late teens into my early 20s, I would say there was a lot of ups and downs in that, in their, stages of contentment, yes, but then other stages of discontentment, if I'm honest with myself. But I found that there was so much joy, there was so much peace when I could just release those things to the Lord and enjoy the stage of life that I was in and enjoy the people that God had put in that stage of life for me then. A lot of those relationships are completely different at this point, 10 years later. So enjoying and being content with the stage of life that you're in I think is a really beautiful thing to embrace in that process. So.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. As well, I'll probably talk a little bit about this now, but probably when I'm talking with your dad. But there was like a breaking point for me where God really showed me that I needed to just be content in Him.
Yeah.
And like you said earlier, there is a point where sometimes you kind of have to give that back.
Yeah.
Not because you tried to take it again, but because there are times when you're like, man, I really want to get married. And you're like, well, that's not obviously what God has for me right now. So you kind of have to just cognitively give that back. And it makes your purpose a little bit clearer. It makes your walk with God clear. It makes a lot of things clearer. Mm-hmm. And that's not a bad thing.
Yeah.
I think in the beginning, the fact that I had to kind of give it up again, I felt like I'd failed. And obviously that's not true. But sometimes it's hard. It's easy to think that, So no, that's awesome. So you got married at 23?
Got married at 23, yeah. And I would say that's still very young.
Yeah.
a lot of just not even knowing who I was at that point, and realizing, wow, this is a huge responsibility, and to navigate life with someone else. And so that's why I say there's a beauty in us embracing the stage that we are in, because there's such beautiful things that we are growing in and learning and being stretched in those different seasons. And now as a married individual, I have different weights and different things that I'm navigating now that are stretching me in different ways than when I was single before being married. But I would say, and I think you kind of touched on it, that the greatest contentment that I found was not necessarily in trying to be content in the stage of life that I was in, although that's part of the process. Ultimately, it was finding contentment in who Christ was. And that ultimately gave me contentment across the board in every aspect of my life. And again, I'm not saying that there weren't seasons of coming back to this. And I think that's the process of surrender. I think in our minds, we think, oh, I have this moment of absolute surrender, and then I never have to come back to that point again. Surrender is something we continuously have to come back to over and over again. It's almost like a muscle that has to be exercised over again, to use language that my dad would use.
Yeah.
It's a spiritual muscle.
Right. Kind of along the same lines, we'll lead into the second question. What should single people be doing? What were things that God started teaching you? Because I think your single years, in a lot of ways, you're meant to, let me say it this way, and you could speak to this more, being married, but I think that your mentality in your single years is really kind of the foundation of obviously your mindset and what you bring into marriage.
Yeah.
And so with that in mind, it's really important for single people to understand, okay, what things am I doing and thinking about in this time frame? Mm-hmm. So do you have things that God really worked with you on, and maybe a couple stories or whatnot of how God worked with you in this area, and what did that look like?
Yeah, I think one of the things that God was just preparing me was just as an individual. And I think, man, if we lean too hard into I'm preparing myself for marriage. It takes us
Right.
takes us out of the being content with the
Yeah.
stage of life that I'm in.
No, I definitely agree with that.
One of the things, just on a practical level, that I feel like God opened up doors, and there was a sense of a little bit of having to have some courage, but it's to step through doors that just opened, and opportunities. And a lot of those were just either service oriented or just, so for example, between the ages of 15 and, once I got married, there were several different years and summers where I got to have the opportunity, for example, to go and work a summer with a contractor up in Logan, Utah here, and that was just really good experience for me. That was the first time I got to read a tape measure, and just on a practical level, construction. I didn't realize later I would run a small construction business back in Indiana, and that would be something that could provide for my family. But I had no idea of that at that point. At that point, it was just an opportunity that came up, and my parents really encouraged me in this, which is a beautiful thing for them to do. There was a good friend of ours that was a contractor up in Logan, Utah, and I went there and ministered at the church there, as well as just on a practical level, learning how to read a tape measure, run a chop saw, use a chalk line, laying out studs, just all of those just very practical things that was just a help later on, and honestly is a help to me currently, just with doing projects here around the church. And then the next summer I went to work with another contractor, and just more exposure, more opportunity as well to be invested into by other individuals. I think that was really important. I remember that summer I went to work in Logan, Utah. Gary Stonehouse was like an individual that was a huge positive influence in my life. But if I hadn't taken that opportunity with the little bit of freedom that I had at that point, then maybe I wouldn't have had that influence, that positive influence in my life. The next year, I went to work with Stan Hernandez, and he was a very godly, positive influence, just on a personal level, as a 16, 17-year-old young man, navigating the later teen years, just to have an older, wiser individual, not only instructing me in a practical way, but just with life lessons and experiences that they themselves had and pouring into me. So those were great opportunities. At 18 years old, I went to intern with Canyon Ridge in San Diego, Linda Vista specifically, and just the exposure there. So there was all kinds of things that were outside of my comfort zone that I feel like in those years you can get pushed into, and you either have the opportunity to step through them or kind of be a little nervous, be a little fearful, and that's okay to be fearful. All of us experience fear and a little bit of anxiety, but just be willing, saying, Lord, is this a direction that you want me to head into? And then jumping into it and learning some things along the way.
Yeah, no, I definitely think for a experience standpoint, something my dad always says is he says, I want all of my boys to be around people that do things better than I do them. And in a lot of ways, that's what happened to you. You went to work with these guys, godly guys. They taught you in a lot of ways, then you learned from them. And I think that's probably one of the greatest things a single person can do.
Yeah.
I've been thinking a lot about the stages of life that God puts us through. And kind of the funny thing right now is you see this pattern in the Bible. For example, Jesus didn't start his ministry till he was 30, right? And then he was 3.5 years, and then he died. But there's lots of actually people in my life who kind of, in some ways, they really followed that pattern. You actually became a pastor here at what, like 31, 32?
Yeah, 31.
Yeah, okay. And then, like for me even, I've been doing stuff in my church, helping start some ministries, but now, like, I'm at 29, and God's moving me to Romania, which is a massive shift.
Yeah.
And something that I've noticed is the years can vary just to some degree, but God has done a lot with my friends, me and you included. around our late 20s, whether single or not. It's just like a weird age marker where God starts like moving in a lot, where we start being leaders
Yeah.
a lot more. Like we stand as leaders, not just as someone who's just like, bouncing along. And your 20s isn't a time to mess around or, just spend endless times doing dumb stuff. We like having fun too, but that was something that I'm really thankful that my dad pushed me to do, and things that you did was really pushing in your single years, especially to do those things.
Yeah.
And
And honestly, there was so much fun in the process of that, in the process of learning and growing and being pushed out of my comfort zone. I mean, Gary Stonehouse was the first one that had me cliff jumping into off of a cliff into a, I don't even know, like it was so shallow that I hit the bottom of the rock. But that was the first time I'd ever done anything like that. So that, there's experiences I wouldn't have had had I not just stepped into them with the help of the Lord. As a teenager, I was a very, very shy kid, very shy, like very kept to myself. You've known me for a long time.
Yeah.
There was that season of time, and I don't know what I was dealing with. A lot of pride, honestly, thinking I'm too cool. But then
when you wouldn't let me be the quarterback that one time.
Yes, you had to bring that up.
It just came to mind, which is the funny part.
I did apologize.
You did.
I did apologize.
Yeah, for the record, everyone, he did apologize, though.
That's a story from, we were at youth camp together, and your church kind of got tied with our church, and I was kind of the counselor, but I was like 18, 19 or something like that. So still very young, still very full of pride. I'm still full of pride currently, but it was just, very apparent. And we were playing football, and David just has a better football arm than I do.
I think I was like 15 or 16 somewhere
so
in there.
you're a few years behind me, but my pride would not let you be the QB. I was like, no, I have to be the QB. And I threw an interception at the very end of the game to lose the game, and you were so upset with me. And and then like after it, I was like, dude, I'm supposed to be the counselor here, and I'm like letting my group down, and because of my own pride. And so I had to come back and eat crow and humble myself. But like things that, just learning even through mistakes.
And the funny part was, like, I actually wasn't that perturbed about it. It was like, because you were the older counselor, and you'd always been kind of, and I respected you even, just because of our family's relationships. Right. And
but it's kind of like that older brother.
Yeah. And you threw the interception, and I was like, oh, that didn't turn out too good. And then you're like, hey, I'm sorry, man. And I was like, no problem. And then years later, we talk about it, and we're just laughing. Anyway, that was funny. I took you right off your course of thought.
Yeah, I don't even remember where we're at.
We were talking about God giving us experiences through something I wanted to touch on when you were talking about open doors is, I'd say as a young person, you get your vision from seeking the face of God. Mm-hmm. As you start to seek God, as you start to read the Bible and say, Lord, I'm a vessel that's wanting to be used, God will give you open doors in your young years to do stuff, whether it's missions trips, career opportunities, whatever it may be. God will give you the skill sets. Looking back at my life, of all either the schooling I did or the different jobs I had, God used all of those things to kind of mold me in all the little special aspects that I would need in the future. And looking back 10 years from, starting to do alert training at 19 to working in Nevada and doing a bunch of other things and going to like missionary survival school, all that stuff kind of God allowed me to do to kind of prepare me for the future. And in a lot of ways, like your construction experience, God was preparing you for a job in Indiana when you would get married and things of that nature. So I guess while I'm thinking about it too, all the young people, don't and the other thing is, looking back, there was a lot of lonely times. Like it's how it is, especially when you're an older single like me. But I don't actually remember those like more lonely or bad times. I don't. Like, I remember all the things God did. I remember all the things God brought me through. And it's actually it's actually a good memory. There are regrets, but it's a good memory of the things that God allowed me to do as I continued to walk with Him. Anyway, so that was kind of the point. And then, so you were working with Stonehouse doing some other stuff, and then you moved. Did you move to Indiana after you met her and all that?
Yeah. So that opens up another opportunity. Was when I was 21. There was an opportunity to work at a youth camp up in southern Indiana, and at this point, I'm living in Southern California. And so in my mind, I was like, this opportunity came up. It was presented. I had run into the director of the camp in Southern California. We had a quick conversation about him needing some counselors up there. And I just kind of, back in my mind, was like, well, maybe it's something I'll pray about. But I knew that there were plenty of other opportunities that were local, like in Southern California. I was working with our little youth group at the church there. And so I knew there was stuff that could be done locally. But I legitimately prayed about it and felt prompted to go that next summer. So I met the director in the fall of 2012 and ended up going to that camp in 2013. And that's where I met my wife, Savannah. But I had no clue that was going to take place.
You weren't going for that. You were just going
I was
because God was
going,
opening the doors.
Yeah, there was a part of it. It was like, here's an opportunity. And sometimes I think we get so fearful about some of these things because we're so worried about, am I doing God's will or not? And I just want to encourage you who are listening that God's will is less of a location, and it's more of a position of my heart. Lord, I just want to serve you. Lord, I want to reach people. This is an opportunity to minister to young people from the ages of 8 years old all the way up to seniors in high school. And it was a great opportunity of growth for me in a personal way, as well as pushing me in my spiritual walk to pray for others, to minister to others, to pour into others. Singleness is lonely because sometimes we get a little self-absorbed or thinking about ourselves. And when we can think selflessly or when we can think sacrificially outside of ourselves, it allows us to find contentment and joy in serving others, obviously for the glory of God. And that's so much more satisfying than us kind of, moping around trying to, man, I'm in this season and it's a little lonely. And there are those seasons, and embracing them is a good thing. But selflessness really combats that when we're thinking outside of ourselves. And this is something I've seen in your life. You have had many opportunities to serve here, for example, just coming and being a help for nothing, sacrificially coming and just, being a help and an assistance to our ministry here. That was a huge blessing, and it allowed you opportunities here and relationships here that maybe you wouldn't have had otherwise. And then we're the benefits of it as well. And, we're like extremely grateful.
Yeah.
You got some good food out of it, though.
I did. I got some great food out of it, that's for sure. The pounds are showing. That is, I lost my train of thought, but that's okay. It'll come back to me later. The other question I wanted to ask you was, are church people, do church people have generally a positive or a pessimistic outlook on marriage? This was something Daniel and I talked about, and it was really weird because Daniel had kind of a list of questions that he wanted to ask me, and then I had a list of questions to ask him. Yeah. And the funny thing was, both of us had the exact same question at the top of the list, and it was, it wasn't necessarily a question; it was more of an observation to talk about, and that observation was, a lot of times churches or even church people don't really know, or even parents sometimes don't really know what to do with you when you're single, and you're old enough to get married. And so there's always like this, everything is kind of around, oh, maybe this or maybe that or maybe this. And then as soon as you get married, there's like, oh, it's over for you, and like, I faced a lot of that pessimism
Yeah.
to some degree, and also it's like, hurry up and get married. Now you're married. Oh, now you get the ball and chain, kind of. And
Yeah,
I've
yeah.
always found that a bit odd, because, the Bible, it says in Proverbs, a man that findeth a wife findeth a good thing and
Yeah.
findeth favor of the Lord.
Yes.
But quite frankly, if I'm honest, that's really not the consensus that you hear in people. And I just want to get your take, I guess. Like, what do you think why do you think that may be, and stuff of that nature?
Yeah, I definitely think that we swing to one extreme or the other. So either it's highly pessimistic when it comes to the marriage relationship, and you lose all your freedom and your liberty to do anything. And I would say there's a dramatic change. There is a change.
There is a dramatic change. Yeah.
The fact that you're entering into a relationship with another person means there's a whole lot of self-sacrifice that's going on, time-wise, energy-wise, towards that other person. I mean, you just have to read 1 Corinthians chapter 7 when Paul talks about this. Paul talks about singleness versus the married, and there's an aspect where once you are married, you now care for the things that are worldly when it comes, and that's just on a practical level when it comes to your spouse, versus in the singleness stage, you care for those things of the Lord. And it kind of seems, what is going on there? But it really, what he's saying is that, there's a change, but they're actually good changes. There's different growth that is taking place in those two different seasons, to be able to have the time and freedom to dedicate to drop everything and go to Romania like you're doing here in just a couple months. That's a blessing. That's huge. God is going to be able to use you in a different way than he can use me as an individual. But I would say we swing from one direction to the other. Those who are experiencing really tough things in their marriage often don't have a lot of good things to say about marriage because they're navigating difficulty or in their relationship. And so we often hear that, that overflow of the baggage that they're carrying when it comes to their marriage relationship, which is not exactly what they expected it to be. And I think that's where we swing to the other side, where sometimes there's an over-romanticized view of marriage, like that it's just like this, you get married and there's just like this, shower of hearts that comes, falling down from the sky in the heavens.
I love how you visualize that whole
that's just
thing.
What I have in mind. Like red hearts just, just coming out of the heavens. And that's how we view marriage. And I would say marriage is absolutely a beautiful thing. It's one of the greatest relationships that allows you to understand our relationship with God, the intimacy of that. But marriage is also one of the hardest relationships you'll ever navigate in life. One of the most difficult relationships because there's a whole lot of self-sacrifice. And Jesus, of course, exemplified this perfectly when it comes to that, the husband and wife relationship. So I would say on one end, people are really negative about it. Like, oh yeah, you're just in the honeymoon phase and then you'll never love each other again. It's just
they're frozen together.
It's not encouraging whatsoever. So I think one of the things when I was single or just in a developing relationship with Savannah is we wanted to hear from those who enjoyed each other and allowed them to speak into our lives, into the challenges, the difficulty, yet the true depth of love that they had for each other. And so that was something that allowed us to look at marriage in a very realistic way. So there's the pessimistic view, there's the overly romantic view, and then there's just a realistic view of the marriage relationship. It's a absolutely beautiful relationship. But it's the most difficult relationship, I believe, to navigate.
I like how you put that. Something Daniel said in our podcast together was, he said, marriage showed me how selfish I was.
Yeah, oh yeah.
And, funny thing is I at least until then, like I kind of figured, well, there's going to be more give and take. Right now, there's no one, for me to console with. I'm like, where are we going to eat? Well,
Yeah.
I'm choosing. That's a dumb example, but I thought about it more after the podcast. And it's like, yeah, it's true, and because now you have to kind of refer to someone else all the time.
Yep.
And so, yeah, I could definitely see how the selfishness would come out of you. And I do think actually a hallmark of a miserable marriage is just people that are consumed with selfishness.
Yes.
When I look back on the different people that were very pessimistic about marriage that I had talked to, if I would have think back of my relationship with them, they were actually kind of selfish people. And you can kind of see how that bled into the marriage. Now, it's not always true. There are other hardships that happen.
Yeah.
But a lot of times that is a very big hallmark of kind of a miserable people in marriage.
Yeah. Yeah, and it really stems from ungratefulness with what you have. I mean, that sin goes all the way back to Adam and Eve. They were ungrateful with what they had, so they pursued something else that wasn't supposed to be theirs. And then in that process, they began to blame each other. Well, Adam said, it's the woman you gave me,
Right. Yeah, it's true.
And see how ungrateful that was. The different seasons that we are in, whether singleness or married, a lot of true joy could be found in our life if we had gratefulness to God for where we were at and what we possessed, and just enjoyed the journey of where you're walking on that path.
No, that's really good. Another thing, this kind of ties in closely with another. By the way, if you have questions too, just I guess throw them in whenever. I'm just kind of just just walking through them. But this one. So I would say most people are probably going to get married, right? Whether soon or late, probably like 98% of people are going to get married, right? What are things, like there are things now that God has been showing me and teaching me, either about the opposite sex or about, for an example, I'm a bit of a nerd for education. So I actually want to build my kids' education curriculum. That's kind of a big task, but that's something that I want to do. Like I'm determined to do it.
You're going to have to defer to your spouse in that pursuit. Let me know.
Right. I'll defer to her to teach it, but I'm making it.
You're putting your foot down.
I put my foot down. No, I'm just because I'm a history buff and some other things, and I love logic, and I'm like, my kids have to know this. But what are some things that you found out later would have been helpful to know, either going into marriage, things that you didn't know, or things that, if you were looking at your son, Judah, what are things that, as he becomes older, do you want to instill in him for a potential future marriage? What are things that you want him to know? Because, a lot of the listeners now are, people in their late teens, early, late 20s, and obviously older. But if we're talking about single people, that's the age group. What things would be helpful for them to kind of ponder and think about that either you did or you wish you would have done more of?
I think one of the challenges that Savannah and I faced as we entered into marriage is we didn't realize all of the baggage that we carried just from how we were raised, our upbringing, the different backgrounds that we were coming from. And then you're bringing that basically and setting that on one table. So I would say as a single individual, and this is not something I did very well, is get to know who you are on a deep level and understand the hurts and maybe even the roots of bitterness that are being harbored in your heart, that in marriage actually gets widely exposed. Because as a single individual, it's kind of easy for us to keep it packaged because there's not a whole lot of depth There's the heater just bumped on.
It's okay. It's fine.
There's not a whole lot of, unless we have a really, really good friend that you're able to go deep with and walk through just some of these layers of who you are, somebody that understands you well and is able to speak into your life. I would say that season is really good to get to know who you are, and honestly, that comes with your relationship with God as well as approaching the Holy Spirit, and as David would say, search me and know my heart, see if there be any wicked way in me. Those layers of hurt and pain that I was carrying that I didn't realize was there until a deep relationship kind of exposed that, and all of that came pouring out, and it wasn't in a good way at all. So I would say something that would be really, really important in this season is get to know who you are on a deep level, and that comes with the help of the Lord. That comes with the help of some good friends, maybe even some good leadership that can speak into your life, that can kind of walk you through some of that. You've heard the verbiage hurt people,
Right. Yeah.
That is truly the case. And so coming from two different backgrounds, coming from two different cultures, even though, obviously there's the sense of coming from the Fijian culture, but also just Indiana to California, two different cultures that are coming together, two different family cultures coming together. Understanding other people would be another aspect of that. So understanding yourself, who you truly are, and then learning how to understand other people, put yourself in other people's shoes. And I think you and I have had really good experience that, because we've kind of been everywhere and been exposed to all kinds of people, and you're really having to adjust and to different cultures and different people and the ways that people think. That is something that's really, really good for us. Paul said, I became all things to all men that I may win some. He did this when he was proclaiming the gospel. He took it on himself to understand other people and where they were coming from.
Yeah. I'd like to go back and talk a little bit more about knowing yourself, because that I think we should dig a little bit more right there.
Yeah.
Because I think that is, so some of the things that your dad and I talked about, when he was really helping me go through some stuff.
Yeah.
Those knowing who you are is, and it sounds weird because you can take this in a very, and just, for people that are listening, when we say know who you are, this isn't like a humanistic learn to love yourself better. This isn't that.
In the biblical sense, love thy neighbor as thyself.
Yeah, and that there was a test I done. I'm trying to remember the guy's name. He wrote this. Anyway, but there was this test I did. It was called Emotional Response Toward God Test. And it was a list of I think it was 23 questions. And it was, do you think God is really there for you? And you're only supposed to do this so for an example, in your life sometime, or when you're having a hard time, you're really dealing with something, when you're at your lowest emotional state, that's when you need to take this test.
Yeah.
So I had it in my back pocket, or in my phone. And then once I kind of came to man, I'm there's just those days where you're really run down. Life is hitting you at every angle. And I was like, okay, I'm going to fill out this test. So I did it. And when I did that test, it showed me that I was a very insecure person, is what it did. And if you were to ask me outside of that situation, am I an insecure person? I would say no.
Yeah.
Most people, I would say, look at me and someone like you, and we just don't look like insecure people. And I don't think we carry ourselves that way. But when we're honest before God and we're talking about, do we have faith in God? Our insecurities come out because of our lack of faith and belief in God.
Yeah.
And that was a huge help to me to getting to know where my hurts are, because your vulnerabilities is like the big blinking check light that says something's wrong in your past or something you're not doing. And that check light, when you start to, and I'm going to say this too, asking God, and you
Yes.
kind of mentioned it,
Yeah.
just praying to God and saying, God, seek me, like pull this junk out of me,
Yeah.
you know, and it's kind of like a parasite. It won't come out unless you intentionally want it out.
Yeah.
It's not just going to eventually come out unless it's dug at.
Yeah.
And marriage is really one of those tools
Yeah.
that digs at it.
It
But
is.
it's probably good, like you said, to take care of it before it gets dug at.
Yeah,
You know?
and it's not necessarily that you will take care of it, like in getting rid of it completely, because I still
Yeah.
carry those hurts or dealing with with bitternesses that are in my life. I'm still processing that, but beginning the healing process of that, and I think I just didn't even want to address it. You just kind of navigating life, or you're unaware of it. You're unaware
That is a
that
big
it's
one.
there.
That's a really big one, yeah.
Sometimes you're like just having a good time in life, and you're unaware that below the surface, and that's why I think Hebrews specifically says that beware lest any root of bitterness springing up, which tells you that it's below the surface and it's not always seen in an evident way, but eventually it will be seen. And and you mentioned kind of like digging it out. There's a sense where the process of digging and finding those roots and then allowing the Lord to begin the healing process in your life is going to be so beneficial for you in your stage of singleness. And then if God allows you to enter into marriage, that will only continue the sanctification process and healing process for you, because marriage definitely exposes it.
Yeah. I'm sure it's true. I'm not going to say it is true because I'm going to say,
Yeah.
I'm sure it's true.
It is true.
So, and then that was, and then kind of like what you were saying is learn to understand other people.
Yeah.
On that specifically, about a year and a half ago, I was studying missions. I think I was doing like my second, like more in-depth study of missions again. I was going through Acts, and it was like God totally changed my course of study. Like I just started talking to a couple different people, and God started kind of showing me and opening my eyes to different things about the differences in men and women. And I kind of started this study on the differences of men and women, what the Bible says about it. And so like I went through and I studied different influential men in the Bible. And then I went through and studied different influential women of the Bible. Then I went through and looked at what are things God says about men, and then went through and saw what things God said about women. And God really, it was like a year of mostly on and off of studying that. And it was probably one of the most helpful studies I ever did in just being able to understand even myself and men better, and then understanding women a little bit better, and also seeing proper roles and healthy relationships within the Bible context. And that was huge. And I'm just going to say this, I think this is true for kind of the Baptist circle that we grew up in, is there's this, I think, especially second or first generation Christian parents, like both of ours, I would say, there's this desire for their kids not to get into, any kind of sexual sin or any kind of, anything like that, inappropriateness or whatever. That there's just a blanket statement like stay away from all of it until you get married, and then it's time to open that that book. And so something that I was learning was, God was actually teaching me, listen, it's good to know certain things. You should know how, if you're a man, you should know generally how a woman thinks. You should understand what the Bible says. Because if I'm going to find a godly wife, or a woman's going to find a godly husband, she needs to know what she's looking for and then know what's in the Bible. And anyway, I think at least it did happen to some degree in my family. There was this kind of this dearth of even teaching of the godly roles. And so and even how to interact. I'm not going to get into it all now because it's a huge, long conversation. But I think that's also needful too. As you were saying, understanding other people, is
Yep.
kind of knowing how to interact with the roles, what's good, what's not good.
Yeah.
Something as simple as having Vlad and I were talking today, and he grew up in a public school, and he was just kind of the way the setting was of the school. He hung around pretty much only, Slavic people in the public schools. And because of the different lunch hours and all that, he was saying he ended up hanging out with just a lot of girls. And he said, my relationships with them were platonic. They were very, and so he was like, I was just friends with girls, kind of, period. And people thought, people like, oh, you might be gay, or all this other crazy stuff. But he was like, no, I was just friends with them. And then as time went on, and he kind of continued that pattern of just being, having like girl best friends and all that, he realized, and now like he told me in the car today while we were working, he was like, even though I could have platonic relationships, it's only a matter of time before someone gets stuck to the other person. And just that, even that concept of also knowing what relationships are healthy and worth having and which ones aren't.
Yeah.
Because me and a lot of my friends have kind of fallen into this pit where someone else got hurt or they got hurt because they didn't understand what an appropriate balance was.
Yeah.
But anyway.
Yeah, no, I think understanding that we are able to have, in that stage of singleness, just being able to have relationships across the board with both guys and girls is such a wonderful thing. And even after you're married, like you can still embracing those friendships and relationships. And I think what you're saying is that sometimes we're trying to steer away from any temptation of any kind, that we avoided any relationship at all with the opposite sex, which is absolutely very unhealthy. It's very unhealthy, and actually it creates the scenario where then every relationship with the opposite sex then only can be centered around focusing on the temptation of it, which is actually a very unhealthy view of those relationships. But yeah, coming back to just having those beautiful relationships with each other, but also understanding, that God has designed men and women to be in companionship in marriage with each other, and understanding each other, and understanding, as a single guy, I remember having to navigate this, just being careful of even friendships, not leading someone on, or seeing somebody begin to become emotionally invested or connected, and making sure that I guarded, their purity, my purity, and just being concerned for them, and maintaining, hey, this is just a friendship, and allowing that to take place. But yeah, I mean, understanding each other, understanding the difference in men and women, but also understanding that each personality is very different,
Right.
Even within all ranks of men and women, we're all very different. There's a special, identity that all of us have, yet we all come under the image of who God has made us to be. And I would say at the end of, like, your question was, at the beginning of this, was what lessons did God teach you while single? I come back to the same answer I gave earlier, which was just contentment in Him, contentment in Jesus. And that was just a continuous reminder to me, and that allowed everything else to flow from that.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I have one more question,
Yeah.
but before we get to it, did you have anything that you wanted to talk about or address?
Yeah, I don't know if you've talked about this before, but what do you feel like is you mentioned you're now in your late 20s, in navigating singlehood. What do you think has been like the most difficult thing that you've faced during this season? Like between 20 and 30. When are you turning 30?
Like a year and a half or less than a year and a half.
Still a little ways out, right?
Yeah.
But between 20 and 30, what do you think has been like the most difficult thing to navigate through that?
I would say one of the big things that I had to deal with, and I don't know if this is just peculiar to me or if this is kind of maybe a bigger problem, but growing up, my dad always said, love God, marry right. Love God, marry right. Like that was something that was kind of drilled into us. And I would say for Christian young people, that is getting married right is more of an aspiration than it is for someone unsaved. I think that's definitely true. And so what I ended up doing in a large sense was I held up getting married right as actually an idol for years.
Yeah.
And what it did was it hindered my forward movement with God. And so actually your dad at one point, we'll probably touch on this when I talk with your dad, because it was just kind of very pivotal in my life. And so when I look at, and I can see it in other single people, there's a lot of single people out there that just kind of live pessimistic lives. They're Christians. They want to do what's right.
Yeah.
They're either in missions a little bit or they're not, or whatever it may be. But they're very kind of miserable and pessimistic.
Yeah.
And I was that way. And I think the reason why is because I felt like God was kind of holding out on me in a sense. And then, we've all heard of this idea. It's like, we can't move on until we're married. It's like, oh, that's the next step. And then I can move on with my life, And I think for me, that was probably one of the biggest things that held me back. I would call it the idol of marriage. That's what your dad called it too, is the idol of marriage. It was holding me back from really seeking God and what he wanted. Yeah. And that bitterness, I think, actually produces other problems. It produces, a lot of men struggle with pornography. I did for a while. And that's not just a man thing, that's a woman thing too. There's a lot of other things that come along with that. But really what it is, it's overall kind of a bitterness against God for withholding something from you. And until I really gave that up, so I'll preface the story by, when your dad first told me, this was years ago, he said, David, your idol is wanting to get married. And he said, you need to get rid of that. And what he meant was, you can't have that anymore, obviously. And I was like, okay. And what I was thinking in my mind was, I'm going to push down that desire, right? Which is actually an unhealthy thing. That's not anyway. And so what I did was, people would make comments, or a girl. I think after he first told me that, I had asked 2 different girls out, which I thought were godly girls. I liked them, and they said no, and it just hurt a lot, and I was very. I just got kind of bitter about it, And this bitterness kind of just kept creeping into me. Like, it was relentless, and I couldn't get rid of it. I just kept kind of pushing down my feelings, like, oh, it's fine, like I'm good. And it actually never was. And the crazy part was, I did it long enough, I actually believed my own lie, that I was fine. And then your dad, I think this was like 2 years ago now, your dad, I called him about something. Another question I had, and he totally ignored my question. It was on like maybe the next stage of what God might have me do or whatnot, and it actually wasn't. But your dad knew what was still eating me, and so he just kind of ignored that question, and he said, David, I don't have an answer for you there. He says, but I do have this for you. And then he proceeded to say, you're still pessimistic. You still have bitterness. I see the way you act. I see your misery, all these things. And he said, you still have that idol. And what it did was and the thing was, when he was telling me this, I was so angry. I was genuinely so angry, but I wasn't angry at him. I was angry because I knew he was right, and I missed it. I missed it. And, so I was driving on my way home from work, and like, I just sat there, like just stone still in the car. And I had a couple of my siblings with me, and they're like, don't talk to David right now, So I get home, and what I had to do was I took a walk into the woods, and I really just had to get on my face, and I just wept. And I was like, Lord, like, this thing that's hindering me, you have to take it. And it was, because at first it was, I am going to conquer this, I'm going to push it down. And then it was realizing I can't, and God has to. And then it was just a cry for God, you have to do this because I can't. And once that happened, it was like so many chains just started lifting off of me. And that was when God really started, and that, like, right after that happened was when God started working in my life to start a ministry in our church called Gospel Corner Project. Soon after that, I did a couple more trips. It was like those chains were being released, and God was allowing me to now do more.
Yeah.
And it was because I didn't have that hindrance. I didn't have that bitterness anymore. And that was just, for me, that was probably the hardest thing. And really, actually, what it came down to was bitterness. I was kind of mad at God that He, like, wasn't giving me what I thought was next in life, and I think that's actually one of the root problems.
Yeah.
Is we believe that this is the next step in life and God's not giving it to me, therefore God's the one holding out, not me. And if God would only give me what's next in life, then I could do my thing, And that was the hardest thing for me to deal with.
Yeah.
And once those chains came off, and once that clarity came and that pessimism went away, like, I was free. Now, it doesn't mean I didn't either get lonely or I didn't really want to get married. Those things still there.
Yeah.
And even since then, I asked one girl out. But it was night and day difference. It was like, it didn't work out. And it was like, okay, great. Like, and I can genuinely laugh at myself, like, people will poke fun at me because I am older and single and stuff. And like, I actually join them in the fun. Like, I genuinely like think it's hilarious, And I think that is kind of also one of the hallmarks of being free is like, it just doesn't bother you anymore, And one of my reels that I made for my podcast, I think off of Daniel and I's thing is if I wake up one day and I'm 70, not married, and like, oh, dang, I'm not married. Oh, well, keep serving God. It's kind of, that's kind of the mindset now.
Yeah.
And I think that's what every young person should be at.
Yeah.
But it takes that surrender. And it doesn't even have to be like an idol of marriage. There's a lot of things. But I've noticed that a lot of times one idol there's like one idol and there's several chains of bondage that are around that idol. And until that idol is broken, those chains all won't be released.
Right.
So I think sometimes we're shooting at like symptoms in our Christian life, but we're not dealing with that issue. And for me, it was that.
Yeah. And this is a principle that applies beyond both stages, and I think we draw such a hard line for whatever reason between singleness and marriage, but you're the same individual.
Yeah.
You are the same person. There's not something that magically happens after you get married. So this principle applies in both realms, even when it comes to purity as you're navigating that, but then just even finding sufficiency in who God is in the stage of singleness. I feel like I've had to be pushed more and more in that area after being married. More after being married than when I was in the single stage. Because now what happens is when you get married, you seem to think, well, now I have my spouse, now I need to find my sufficiency in her, right? She becomes my world. She becomes my focus. And unfortunately, she can become my idol as well. And
that's very true.
And the truth is that amount of pressure put on a spouse to meet the level of sufficiency for Aaron Sikele is unattainable. You know what I mean? Like, we don't have the capability to provide everything for the other person that the other person needs. That true sufficiency can only be found in who God is. And so if I learn that in whatever stage I am, Paul said it, whatever state I am, therewith to be content.
You started saying it and realized, oh, that's a verse.
Paul, obviously an example of living his life completely single, found contentment in who God was. He was heavily involved in ministry, but he also let others pour into him as he ministered to others. Jesus is another, the person that we pattern our entire lives around. Jesus himself exemplified singleness and his purity in his relationships with both men and women. There was a group of women that followed Jesus and his ministry, and there was something beautiful about the purity with which he navigated those relationships, that those women felt such security and safety in his presence as a single 30-year-old man. And so there's something powerful about about the stage of singleness. And I would say, as an encouragement, fully embrace it for the glory of God. And there's so much power and so much potential in individuals, whether young or old, living in the stage of singleness, that God can absolutely use in incredible ways. So I asked you, what was the most difficult thing? What do you think between this stage of between 20 and 30 has been one of the most rewarding or most joyful thing that you've experienced?
That's funny. I wasn't prepared for that.
Sorry.
No, that was good. That was really good. I don't know if I've even thought much about that, but it is. I do have an answer, obviously. I would say following the will of God and watching Him work through my life is just been. It's really blown my mind, especially even now getting ready to go to Romania. There's
with all of its challenges and difficulties that you don't see ahead.
Well, yeah. No, but just the journey even that I've taken so far there's opportunities that I've been able to get a hold of because of where I am at life, right now. And kind of like what you said earlier, there's different strengths and weaknesses to being married or single in the sense of what you can and cannot do. But one of the things that I've loved, I love traveling. I look at people that do the same job for 20 years 20 years straight, and that makes me want to rip my hair out. I can't even fathom that. But God has really allowed me to do things I just never thought I would do in following Him, getting to know Him more, and being on this really just this crazy cool journey. I'm definitely a nomad, kind of have been. I have a base, but I've definitely been kind of a nomad running around. One of the stories I like to tell people, one, just because it just shows you things that God will just let you do when you're following Him. This isn't why you follow God, but it's just a story to show the crazy things God will let you do when you are seeking Him. The other thing too is when you follow God, God just shows you miracles of His providence. There's so many things that have happened in the last 8 years of my life, 9 years of my life, that don't make any sense in a probability basis. It's not. It was all God working these things. And one of the cool stories I like to tell is just watching God work in your life and take you places. So when I went to Thailand, it was really a miracle how that even all worked out. We don't have time for all that, but one of the cool highlights was going there, getting to meet Dave Eubank and spend some time with them and see their ministry, what they're doing. I was with two retired Green Beret guys, and we were in Bangkok getting ready to fly out. And you've known me, obviously, for a very long time. I'm definitely kind of like a military junkie. My gamer tag as a teenager was SEAL Blood, for being a Navy SEAL and all this other stuff. So that definitely, and one of the idols God made me give up when I started following Him was I had to give up what I wanted to do with guns, what I wanted to do with, traveling and being in war zones and all that other stuff, just because it's stuff I like. And so I gave all that up. And so God, through a series of events, let me go meet the Free Burma Rangers and stuff. And then I've got this, retired Green Beret guy that I'm traveling with, and he's like, "Hey, I did 9 tours in Thailand. You want to go to a safe house?" And I'm like, "Sure," And so me and the two guys, we went to a safe house, and long story short, they asked if I wanted. They had this wall of all these people that signed the wall that had been through the safe house. That's cool. And they go, "Do you want to sign the wall?" And I was like, "I'm not even military. I have no really right signing that wall." And they're like, "No, we want you to." And so I got to sign this wall, and I'm like, on what other green planet, does that happen? And it just shows things that God, and if you read missionary stories, there's so much that God lets them do and just amazing things that God just lets them move through. And one of the beauties about being in the spot of life where I am now is I get to do those things. I get to just fly by the seat of my pants to another country. Now in my bag, I always have my passport on me because I never know what I'm doing next. You know, I've literally had people say, "Hey, we're going to go to a country like in 3 days. You want to go?" And it didn't actually happen, but I was totally down to. You know,
Yeah.
there were just other commitments I had to meet. So I'd say that's probably one of the most joyful things is one, getting to know my Savior on a more intimate level.
Yeah.
And then watching him work in all of these areas.
Yeah.
And that actually didn't really culminate until all of my idols were broken.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that has to take place.
Yeah.
Is if you want God to use you effectively and you want to have those adventures. You know, Paul tells Timothy, you know, fight a good warfare, be a soldier. Being a soldier is a hard thing, but it's also an extremely adventurous thing.
Yeah.
And that's the beauty, I think, of being single and being free and being clear with God and being able to do this stuff. And there's just nothing like it.
Yeah.
There just isn't. You know, if God lets me get married one day and I find a girl, then great. I'm looking forward to that adventure too. But
Yeah.
for now, I'm really loving the adventure that I'm
Yeah.
on. And I think it just never gets old when you watch God
Yeah.
work.
Yeah, and that's what's beautiful about just life with God, life in relationship with Jesus, is it is an absolute adventure. And even in marriage, what Savannah and I are walking through is an adventure together with God. And we get to see him work in and through our lives, in and through our brokenness, and produce blessing out of things that we could never have ever imagined. And then you add kids to the equation. And there's another sanctifying process that you go through. So today is actually Zelda, our oldest, 9-year-old, is her adoption day. So 2 years
wow.
ago.
I didn't know that.
January 6th, 2 years ago would have been when we officially adopted her. So we got Zelda 9, Judas 5. River will be a year old at the end of this month. So talk about sanctification.
Judah, that kid cracks me up, man.
Oh, man,
He's like a ball of energy with very
absolutely.
little comprehension involved.
Sometimes too much
Yeah,
comprehension.
One of the verses I wanted to mention earlier, as we're talking, I'm like trying to look up a verse. And I think this is kind of just referring back to that conversation that we had on men and women. And one of the things that I look for now concerning myself and others. Now, there's many things. I think these are highlights, though. There's nothing worse. There are certain traits, there's certain bad qualities, and certain good qualities that I think trump other qualities. Anyway, I'll just get right to the point. There's nothing better than a man being a man, right? There's nothing better than a man standing for what's right. There's nothing better than a man who is secure, who is confident, who's strong in his belief in who God is. And there's just nothing like a man. That's why like the soldier figure or the warrior is so kind of revered as amongst men, you know, and that's like the one of the greatest qualities of a man. And so this verse kind of encapsulates that. Proverbs 16:32 says, "He that is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he that ruleth his spirit than he that taketh a city." And that's one of the verses that I think is very pivotal in knowing, am I a godly man? Is, do I get angry easy, and do I rule my spirit? And I think something for young men and women who are still single and married, obviously, to think about. But for sure, this is the time to do it before you get married, is learn to be slow to anger and learn to rule your spirit. And that is so difficult. No one's perfect at it. And I'm reminded every day how bad I am at it, honestly. And so for a man, if you're a man listening to this podcast, I think one of the greatest qualities in seeking the Lord and being a godly man is one that is slow to anger, one that's gentle, slow to anger, and one that ruleth his spirit. God says that's better than the mighty and a man that can take a city. You know, you see these Green Berets or we see these Delta guys or SAS guys who can go in and just wipe out, you know, tons of soldiers and just take a city. We're like, yeah, that's it, man. You know, a lot of these war movies that I like is like, you know, it kind of strikes to your core. But God said, a man that can rule his spirit and that is slow to anger is greater than that man.
Yeah.
And
true domination is not in the domination of another person or a village. It's in the domination of your own soul,
right?
You know, of your own spirit. And sometimes the criticism between, you know, the differences between men and women. Oftentimes, the criticism towards women is they are so emotional. But the truth is, we're both emotional.
That's
both
very
men
true.
And women. The anger is an emotion. So oftentimes, the primary emotion that comes out in men is anger. And so understanding that we are all emotional beings and learning how to submit those emotions to God and let him guide and direct our heart, our soul, our thoughts, our mind, it just becomes a beautiful thing. I'm reminded of just this verse when it comes to just honestly, whatever stage we're in, whether singleness or married, whether searching or completely surrendered to singleness as Paul the apostle. He writes in Philippians 2, verse 5, it says, "Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who being in the form of God, thought it not robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, and took upon him the form of a servant, and was made in the likeness of men. And being found in fashion as a man, he humbled himself, and became obedient unto death, even the death of the cross. Wherefore God hath also exalted him and given him a name which is above every name." And I mean, just Jesus is our primary example, that we get to be more and more like him. And the truth, as we become more and more like Jesus, we see a lot less and less of us and my reputation and my name and what I want, more self-sacrificing rather than selfishness.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. The other thing too that when I was doing that study was looking at kind of the same characteristic, but what is that in women? And one of the things that I now, my opinion is this right now. Maybe it could change, but I don't know if that's going to happen. The verse is Proverbs 31:26. It says, talking about the virtuous woman, it says, "She openeth her mouth with wisdom, and in her tongue is the law of kindness." And something I've learned through the years just by seeing very gentle, kind women, but also seeing some very angry, bitter women, is I don't know if I can think of anything worse than an angry woman, a bitter and angry woman. And when you look at the different people, and you look at Ruth in the Bible, or you look at Esther, there's this overwhelming love and like sweetness that just pours from them. There's a couple great godly ladies that are just in my life that I see not very often, and they're just always have God, and they're just sweet. And the thing too with the Proverbs 31 woman, it says that in her tongue is wisdom and the law of kindness. And the thing that I really liked is it says it's a law. A law is unchanging. And even if you have to rebuke or you have to do whatever, what is always guiding that necessary thing that's coming out of you is always ruled by kindness. Yeah. And, you know, as we're talking about men being men that can rule his own spirit, I think, and seeing what what personifies a man. I think the thing that personifies a mother or a nurturer or a woman and what her special role is that the best thing to see in them is just kindness, to see sweetness. You know, you love, you know, it's cool to watch a sweet wife, you know, talk with her husband. It's great to watch a sweet mother talk with her kids. It's great to see that attribute. Like there's almost nothing better to see come out of a young lady or an older lady is just sweetness coming out of them and that kindness. Yeah. And, you know, kind of just as we were talking about that thing for the men, I think for the women, that's what, when I see that, even in a younger lady, there's been a couple times where I'll meet some young lady around my age or whatnot, and I see that just sweet spirit come out of them, and part of me is instantly like, I'm interested, because I see that godliness just kind of coming
Yeah.
out of them, and
Yeah.
it's really attractive,
Right.
to see, and you just gravitate towards it. Everybody does.
Yeah, and I think godliness is a good word to put there because it's an attribute of God. Kindness, sweetness, humility is all an attribute of who God is, as well as, you're talking about the men and their characteristics and their personality. Also, we can find our attributes from who God is and the strength that He is, the provider that He is, all that God is can be exemplified, honestly, in both men and women. God would often illustrate, Jesus in the New Testament would illustrate Himself as that mother hen who,
Right.
just desired to tuck those little chicks underneath the wings, just kind of that mothering nature that God has allowed that to be produced in women in a natural sense. All of it stems and is sourced from God Himself, which is just beautiful. It just points us, both men and women, in our respective roles, in our respective identities. We get to find that in who God is, and that's why He truly has to become our sufficiency, because that is the outflow of who we are. And that just gives us so much rest, and we're not trying to we don't get so confused, because we can just come to God and He gives us those attributes, which are beautiful.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. I have one more question.
Yep.
I'll ask this, and then if you have anything else, we can go through that. So talking about, what is good for a single person to do now, things that they should work on, or, all that.
Yeah.
What are things they should keep in mind if a person comes into their life? Like, what are one of the things that really helped me when I was doing this study is, what questions should I ask? What are good key principles that I should use in this realm?
Yeah.
And my, at least experience implementing them is very slim, because my dating experience is close to none.
Yeah.
But obviously for you and Savannah, like, what are things that really, looking back, you're like, wow, that really helped, or these are things that I was so glad I found,
Yeah.
in conversations that I had or whatnot.
Yeah, I think one of the things that both Savannah and I did when we were just getting to know each other, and it started just as a friendship. We were both counselors at a youth camp, and honestly, we were both watching and observing each other from a distance, not realizing that we were, but we were observing each other, and just our actions and reactions to situations, to individuals. We were just kind of observing each other, not in a creepy stalking kind of way, but just we were both observant of each other. And I think there was, an initial just attraction to each other, which I think is
That's good.
Should
That's
be
healthy.
that. Yes,
yeah.
that's a very good
If
thing.
you're not attracted to them, you should probably move along.
Yeah, there definitely is attraction, and so, but that going beyond the physical attraction to just seeing how we navigated different situations. For me, observing Savannah and just how she navigated dealing with kids, difficult kids at a youth camp who, just honestly weren't always behaving the best, but she jumped right in there, and just her spirit and her nature, just having fun with them. I remember just seeing her get barefoot and jump in the creek with a bunch of kids because that's what the kids wanted to do. I found out later she doesn't like to do that at all. She doesn't like to get her feet wet. I find out, I know that now.
Yeah.
But back then, I didn't realize it was actually a self-sacrificial thing for her to do that, to kind of humble herself, put aside her own needs and wants for the sake of others. And that's what, just kind of attracted me to Savannah as I watched her that first summer that we were just kind of getting to know each other. And then in and through conversation, as we got to know each other a little more, you kind of get to see and observe each other's relationship with God in and through the process. You know, early on, we began to have conversations about, you know, difficult things that we've navigated in life with the help of God, and understanding and realizing, oh wow, there is a reliance on God. Sometimes, you know, you and I as guys can be overconfident, and we kind of become self-sufficient. But truly, when we are not confident in who we are, but we're confident in who God is, that is something that is actually, you know, much more attractive than oh, I've got it put together, I've got it made, I've got my goals set, you know. And so us just observing each other in and through that process, and then just being honest with each other, you know, being honest with our communication. Sometimes early communication is kind of, you're trying to say the right thing, you're trying to do the right things. And Savannah actually leaned into this more than I probably did. I mentioned I struggled with pride, still struggle with pride, trying to maintain a self-image, right? Whereas Savannah was just herself. And that was something I truly appreciated, and it allowed me to kind of just open myself up and just be yourself and just be honest with who you are. And with that, you know, as we got to know each other even on a deeper level, just being honest with your struggles of the past, your current struggles, your ups and downs, the relationships that you have a hard time dealing with. And I think with that, I think had we understood more deeply, this is going back to one of the first questions where we were discussing your upbringing or your family of origin and all of that and the baggage that you carry into that. I would say ask the hard questions. You know, what's the most difficult relationship that you have right now? You know, instead of like, what's your favorite color? You know, that's just, you know, those are and not that you meet a girl for the first time and you're like, you know, let's go deep here.
Yeah.
You know, let's go, let's dig deep. Let's get to really know you.
Yeah.
No, but just, you know, as time goes on in that dating process or getting to know each other process, you're getting to see that each other's relationship with God, and then relationships with others. And so on the flip side of that, Savannah was observing me, and I just so happened to have her siblings in my cabin, and I was a counselor. So my interaction with them was something that I didn't realize she was watching very closely, you know, my interaction with them and how I navigated the people that she loved. As well, and you know, in reverse later when she would meet my family and how all of that took place. I mean, I think just understanding where you're coming from, and what your desires are, what your hopes and dreams are, and understanding that not all of those are gonna come to fruition.
Yeah.
Our hope and dreams are found in who God is.
I like what you said about just kind of having those hard questions. I don't remember who I was talking to. About 6 months ago, I was talking to a friend of mine. We had a really good conversation, kind of about hard conversations.
Yeah.
And I'm losing my train of thought. With having those hard conversations, I think are really important, because these are things you should know before you make a vow or commitment. You know, because when you get married, you're making a covenant, not a contract, a covenant with a person. That's a serious deal. You know, and he was telling me conversations that he had with. Obviously, they knew they were both serious. Like you were saying, you don't just have these right off the bat.
Yeah.
You know, you just get to know each other, and then as things get, you know, serious, and like, you both know this is going toward marriage, and that's where we want it to go. Yeah. That's when you really start kind of trying to naturally have those conversations. Yeah. I had one friend who kind of tried to avoid those things, and it turned out bad. You know, because I don't think. He was honestly just trying to impress her so much that he kind of just put his best foot forward, and then they get married, and then all this stuff is coming out. Right. And he even told me later that she said, if I knew all this about you, I don't know if I would have married you. You know, that's something you don't want to face, you know, after the fact. And having those, like you said, those hard conversations or whatever, when you both know, because this is where we're going.
Yeah, because otherwise your relationship is based off of deception, and you don't want it to be that. You want to be honest, be as honest as you can be, while remaining tasteful, but just be honest. And I clearly remember the conversation that Savannah and I just had to go to a deeper level and just expose who we were as humans and our mistakes and brokenness that we brought to the table, and saying, this is who I am. These are the mistakes I've made. This is what I'm carrying into this relationship. And then you make that decision. Am I committing to this relationship together and to work through this brokenness that I carry from my past and you carry from your past, and we're coming together in that and allowing God to bring healing to both of us in and through the process, and allowing His grace to navigate that is such a beautiful thing. And honestly, it's a continual process. Yeah.
Do you have any more questions or anything?
I don't think I have anything off the top of my head. I think we've had
That's pretty good.
Some good conversation here, and we could have this conversation keep going, honestly.
Yeah, well, I think we're both kind of holding back from bleeding into too many areas, because if you do,
because it'll just a whole bunch
conversation.
of rabbit trails, and there's so much that we could cover. I think my culmination of my thoughts of all of this is develop a deep and genuine abiding relationship with Jesus, because that is going to carry you through so much in life. The heartaches, the letdowns, in all stages of life. That foundation, that I know seasons of my life I did not have. That there were seasons of my life where God's hand of grace was extended to me, but I was so angry or so bitter, I pushed Him away, and I was actually pushing away the very thing that was going to bring healing to me. And those were, difficult seasons, not only as a single individual, but then in marriage, navigating that, and then your spouse kind of has to watch you navigate all of that, anger and bitterness. I would say, pursue that relationship with Christ. And if you don't know Him, if you don't know Him yet, if you've never been introduced to Him, I would say get to know Him. Allow Him to introduce Himself to you through the Scriptures, through just opening yourself up to God and saying, God, I don't know who you are. Maybe you already know Him in a personal way, but you're like, I still don't understand who you are. Just open yourself up to Him and allow Him to work some miraculous things in your life. That would be my encouragement.
Yeah, no, I definitely can second that. Your dad, I think, coined the phrase dangerous prayers.
Yeah.
Some of the best prayers I ever prayed in some of my hardest times were like, God, just do whatever you have to. Mm. Bring me back to you. Mm. There's been a couple times in my life where honestly, God was asking me to make a decision I couldn't bring myself to make. Yeah. And I had to say, God, I'm willing to be made willing. Mm. And sometimes those are the most important prayers you can pray. Yeah. I really, really enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, me too.
It's really been great. We're at an hour and 28 minutes right now. So, I doubt we'll have a chance to do this again before I leave. But, for all of you listening, I really hope you enjoyed the podcast. If you have any questions or even want to check out the, Abiding podcast?
Yeah, it's just the Abide podcast. You can look up Camas Bible Baptist Church. That's CAMAS. And you can find us there. Yeah,
they've got some great stuff. They post stuff every week from their sermons, and then I think semi-regularly they're going to start doing kind of conversations and working through issues.